In some of your work, you've talked about the four left waves which have arisen out of Latin America. In this context of both a leftward shift in the region, but of also a more general unity of La Patria Grande, can you talk a bit about what makes this fourth wave different from the former ones? How did the previous ones lay the ground for it? How does the crisis the US empire is facing in light of a resurgent multipolar world intensify the influence and potential of this recent fourth wave?
See, Carlos, let's put it this way. Cuba today has a population of about 11 million people. It's a very small island, very small population in comparison to the world population, 7.9 billion. And yet, remarkably, in 1959, when the Cuban Revolution took place, it shook the world, not just the island of Cuba, it shook the world. And if we want, we can come back to that. But let's just stay with Latin America. It shook Latin America. And yes, there have been four waves of revolutionary developments since the Cuban Revolution. Of course, there were waves prior to that. There's the Great Mexican Revolution of 1911 and so on. I'm not going to discuss that because the modern impact of these revolutionary waves emanates out of Cuba, 1959, not really out of the Mexican Revolution, although, of course, there's continuity. So let's just start from 1959. The first major wave out of Cuba was a kind of Guevaraist strategy of creating revolutions across the hemisphere. And that, includes, for instance, Hector Behar leading a political force in Peru. It includes Douglas Bravo with the Focos in Venezuela. It includes various groupings all across the continent, including in most of the Central American countries. Well, these developments were smashed by the United States of sending the military out of the barracks in almost all of these countries. From Brazil in 1964, that coup that lasted 21 years, out to the coup against the people of Chile. We began with Victor Jara. Victor Jara next year, 50 years since his murder, his assassination, but also 50 years since the coup in 1973 against the Popular Unity government of Salvador Allende. So the first phase of counter-revolution was setting in play militaries out of the barracks, including through a project known as Project Condor, Operation Condor, to go after the Guevaraists that were inspired by the Cuban Revolution. That was the first wave. The second wave develops in the 1970s. Two emblematic events, the Nicaraguan Revolution of 79 and the New Jewel movement and revolution in Grenada in 1979. Well, the reaction to these movements was direct military intervention by the United States. No more really reliance on getting militaries such as in Brazil or in Argentina to leave the barracks. Now the US just comes in and builds, whether they invade Grenada as they did under Ronald Reagan, or they have proxy armies built like the Contras and others in Central America to come in and essentially militarily campaign. They allowed societies to be plunged into civil war in order to destroy this second revolutionary wave. And that's the wave that goes right into El Salvador, breaking that society, Guatemala, horrendous human rights abuses and so on. But it does, to some extent, constrain the revolutionary wave. It's held in Nicaragua, but it's constrained in other places, including in El Salvador. The third wave opens up in the late 1980s when Hugo Chavez develops a strategy. After having attempted a coup d'etat, he develops a electoral strategy in the 1990s and wins a magnificent victory in 1998 in Venezuela and opens up this Bolivarian regional project. Now, because of high commodity prices, as the United States, distracted by its illegal wars in the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq, a space opens up in Latin America for the Bolivarian project to articulate itself. As I said, high commodity prices helps. This is also the period when Lula is in power in Brazil, Lula 1, Lula 2. There is a gap between Chavez and Lula in this era, but certainly it's quite an interesting development, this second phase. This third phase. This third phase is attacked in a new counter-revolutionary wave, which included the collapse in commodity prices, a kind of hybrid war against Venezuela's intensified illegal unilateral sanctions, lawfare against Lula, legislative fare against Dilma, lawfare against the government of Lugo in Paraguay, and so on and so forth. That was the counter-revolution to that third wave. Now the situation is changed. Now we are in a situation where mass movements, as a consequence of the counter-revolutionary developments in the third phase, as a consequence of the collapsed commodity prices, as a consequence of the pandemic and so on, people's movements are fragmented in many parts of South America and Central America. And what you have now is the possibility, the maximum possibility of social democratic or center-left forces coming to power. There's no surprise, therefore, that you're going to get, say, a Gabriel Boric come to power in Chile, very narrow, agenda, but also a very narrow frame of possibilities for any government that comes to power there. We're seeing that across the border in Argentina, great convulsion within the ranks of the ruling alliance between, say, the center-left or the left Peronists who are with Cristina Kirchner, and then the more right section with Alberto Fernandez. But you also have surprises. The surprise victory of Gustavo Petro and Francia Marquez in Colombia is something to behold. A wretched oligarchy in that country has not had a left or even center-left or even liberal government since 1810, when Colombia was founded. And here comes Petro and Marquez, and they're doing a very good job moving as much of an agenda as is possible, including, as you say, normalizing relations with Venezuela, but much more than that, trying to complete the peace process, not only with the FARC, which was already completed in the Havana Accords, but now with the ELN. So we are in a new period where even Lula is much more radical than he was in the 2000s. He likely will win on October the 30th. Brazil is a very conservative country, so you can't expect a lot. The Congress is going to be controlled by the right, the so-called Central. They'll control the Congress, but Lula is going to move a regional agenda. So, as Marxists, we have to pay attention to what Marx and Engels wrote in the German ideology. They said communism is the real movement of history. It's not a fantasy. You can't bring communism from your head into the world. You have to bring communism from struggles, dealing with the actual realities in the world, create an actual movement in the world, and establish our ideas through our struggles, not just put our ideas from our heads. It doesn't work like that. And therefore, we need to be extraordinarily training each other in political education, in the nature of struggles, trying to understand the limits to political work. I'm not in the world of shopping where I say, Boric is not great, somebody is better, and so on. That's not a good way to understand politics. One has to understand what is possible, what is somebody able to move an agenda beyond what's possible, what could happen, how is the most effective way to do critique, and so on. You've got to have a method in how we assess these governments, not just a matter of taste. I have an ideal type socialist, and then I measure actual existing socialists based on an ideal type. That's idealism, friends. We are not idealists. We are materialists. We have to understand the real movement of history.